It was a spring morning, and I'd been up all night reading, and I was sitting in a chair in the front room, which had been the old box office, but was now where we lived. There was a fireplace, a rather beautiful fireplace, but this was like 6 o'clock in the morning. It was a spring morning, so it was absolutely light, and I realised I wasn't frightened, but I was startled that I wasn't alone in the room. And I looked up, and I saw these buckled shoes, and this man standing in what was the ash of the fireplace. And he had buckled shoes and quite thick stockings. He was very tangible. He was a very tangible, fleshy, physical, burly man, I suppose in his mid-late 40s. And he looked at me with the same curiosity that I looked at him. Like, what are you doing here in my house?
I've always been intrigued by the idea of ghosts, and being of a sceptical nature, I'm open to all manner of explanations. When someone talks of a ghost that they've seen, could it actually be the spirit of someone returning from the dead, or is it more likely to be a hallucination of some kind, or a slippage in time, or even the brief interface between two separate dimensions? I've recently been touring the country with a couple of plays, based on two famous ghost stories. The Signalman by Charles Dickens, and Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad by M.R. James. Not unnaturally, this has sparked off an interest in the phenomenon we call ghosts, and virtually all the theatres we played in had a story to tell. But it wasn't until we got to the Palace Theatre in Southend that we began to experience these things for ourselves. On the opening night, we'd been going for about 20 minutes, and I was lying in bed waiting to be haunted in the play, when I saw the stage manager at the foot of my bed walking towards the audience and telling them that we'd have to stop because there'd been a rather serious technical mistake. In the silence that followed, I decided to talk to the audience just to pass the time, and I said, "Has anyone got a ghost story they could tell?" And this man stood up and he said, "I have. I can tell you about George. He's the theatre ghost. He fell from the flies during the building's construction and he died later in hospital. He haunts the place." Now, every performance that followed that, something went wrong. Technically, lamps didn't work, things hadn't been plugged in. And on the Thursday, something rather spectacular happened, which I'll talk about later. Now, Terry Hardiman, who I was working with in nearly all these scenes, is a very stable, very serious chap. And he rang his wife, who is much more psychically inclined, to ask what he should possibly do. And she told him, "Oh, it's quite easy. You just talk to the ghost and tell them to stop it," and they do. So to my astonishment, as we crossed underneath the stage on the Thursday, something having gone wrong again during the afternoon, Terry stopped dead in his tracks and said, "George, will you just stop it, please?" He was very good at being authoritative. "We don't want any more of this. Stop." And it did stop. The performances that followed were free from any such interference. And I suppose the idea for this programme began on that opening night. So later in the week, I asked the members of the company if they'd ever experienced something similar. Terry had this to say.
I was at Bristol Old Vic, and it was said that the Theatre Royal, the lovely old 18th century theatre, was haunted, and that there was a lady who walked across the upper gallery from time to time, and there were members of our company who said they saw her. And then I heard that it was thought that Sarah Siddons, who was the famous 18th century actress, she haunted the place. We had a night watchman at the theatre there who had an Alsatian dog, and he said, one day told us, he said, "The dog went mad last night and went charging all over the theatre and went through the auditorium, jumped up at the wall at the back of the foyer. And there used to be a painting of Sarah Siddons there. Well, he was scrabbling around at the wall, and later they excavated it in the sense that they ripped away some of the old wallpaper, and behind this wallpaper was a door they didn't know was there. And they opened it up, and there was an office, a funny little office that Sarah Siddons had used when she'd worked there.
Sometimes, though, the explanation isn't at all what you expect. This is Dickon Ashworth's story.
Mine was at Bolton Octagon, and the front of house manager was this sort of feisty little lady, a real character. We'd done the show, and she came rushing backstage and said, "I think somebody's died during the show and they're in the auditorium." So we rushed out, and from the stage, quite far back in the auditorium, you could see this hand sort of grasping the back of the seat. So everybody thought, "Oh my God." Anyway, when somebody went up there, it was a false arm propped up against the back of the row of the seats. And apparently, this guy had been watching the matinee. His false arm had been irritating him. He took it off, propped it against the back of the row of seats, and forgotten. How you can forget your false arm, I don't know. But he'd forgotten to take it with him. And sure enough, about an hour later, he came back to collect it.
Let's look at some other, less prosaic explanations. Archie Laurie has been a professional psychic investigator for many years.
Theatres are buildings of high emotion, and therefore I would quite believe that there were more psychic events in them in general than in, say, an office or a factory or even a private house. We're a long, long way from obtaining knowledge about the psychic world and how it works. But as we move forward to gain this knowledge, we're meeting parts of science that are beginning to look as if they might tie up with what we already know. Quantum physics is so strange and so unusual, with so many twists and turns to it, that it is the nearest authenticated science that I can think of that one day may very well dovetail with the science of the psychic world.
My name is Bernard Carr. I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at Queen Mary, University of London. One of the interesting points about modern physics is that the view of reality you have is very different from the standard old-fashioned picture of physics of 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the arena of physics was ordinary three-dimensional space. And Einstein introduced time, so there was four-dimensional space-time. But that was the classical view of physics. But what has also been revealed by modern physics, at least the theories of modern physics, is that there could be extra dimensions. The idea goes all the way back to the 1920s, where we needed a fifth dimension to explain electromagnetism, and nowadays in string theories you need many extra dimensions, maybe 10 or even 11 dimensions in theory in total required to explain the physical world. Now this picture is very remote from everyday common sense reality, because we're never aware of these extra dimensions, because our physical senses, our bodies, aren't able to detect them. But in theory, they could be there. And if you have a model like that, it seems to me that you do, in principle, have the possibility of accommodating these sorts of phenomena.
It's rumoured that Grimaldi will haunt the stage and will actually give a kick up the bottom to anybody that's not actually giving a full performance or working hard enough.
The Theatre Royal Drury Lane is the oldest theatre site in Britain and our most haunted. Archivist Mark Fox told me that resident ghosts include two 19th century greats, Dan Leno and Joseph Joey Grimaldi, the father of English clowning.
There are stories of people who've actually felt something on their back pushing them into a correct position or into a light when a light's failed, or actually sometimes being moved on stage as though they've been pushed just as a piece of scenery's fallen down. Lots of people get confused as well over there. There's a story about Grimaldi's head appearing, floating in the box, and lots of people think that's here. But that was a story from the old Sadler's Wells Theatre.
So I went there to meet critic and Sadler's Wells expert Sarah Crompton.
I haven't seen him. I mean, it's possible that his influence was so hugely great that, you know, people always wanted to see him. People wanted to keep the spirit of Grimaldi alive. Theatres, as I mean, you know much better than me, are in their bones, in their bodies. They're all about their history. They're all about looking backwards as well as forwards. And so I think the idea that there are spirits and ghosts and presences is perfect in theatres. You want them there.
My name's Dr. Caroline Watt, and I'm a founder member of the Koestler Parapsychology Unit at the University of Edinburgh. I think as soon as you walk into a theatre, particularly if that's where you work, the smells, The sights, the atmosphere, there are old photographs on the walls, the old posters on the walls, all of these things help to generate an atmosphere, if you like, and an expectation. This will prime the mind of the actor to think about the history of the theatre and maybe perhaps quite unconsciously set their brain working as to what's happened in this place before, and then when it comes to them being tired or perhaps only seeing little glimpses of ambiguous shapes and images, they may interpret these in terms of their expectations that are perhaps supported by the environment that they're in.
Roy, sorry to interrupt, sir.
That's all right.
We're just doing a little bit of recording for a Radio 4 show.
And you want me to be quiet?
No, actually, quite the opposite.
I'm at the Theatre Royal in Brighton with General Manager John Baldock and former stage manager Roy Rowe.
And I figured that if anybody would know anything, all the years you've spent here, you'd sort of perhaps have experienced something.
I can't honestly say I've ever seen or heard anything.
Oh, fair enough.
But there are loads of different stories. One of our lads, when I first came here, a young electrician, we were doing a get-out one Saturday night, and the electrician sent him up into the gods to bring some lamps down.
Right.
And the bloke's voice said good evening to him, and there was no one up there.
Right.
And it frightened him to death. And he came down here as white as a sheet, and he swore he would never go back up there. But all the pipes going down the corridors, sound travels down pipes, as you know.
Yeah.
And late at night, you get people out there talking, and it sounds sometimes, it's like the voices are in here.
There's the story about the family and the person watching as well, kind of another tale of somebody that came to see a children's show, and they were sat out here in the main sort of house. The dad rang up afterwards to ask who the lady in fancy dress was in one of the boxes, because the kids had been pestering him to say who was the lady in the box. They phoned up and got through to us, and they were told, well, with nobody, because actually the box wasn't sold that day. But they described this lady in sort of a crinoline gown, and I think a lot of theatres have got a grey lady. I don't know why, but we've certainly got a grey lady that everybody talks about, and we think it's Mrs. Nychart, who was sort of the manager in the late 1800s.
For actor Fiona Shaw, the very fabric of the building has a role to play.
There have been terrible accidents in the theatre. You know, sometimes sandbags fall out of the flies, or, you know, something goes bang in the night, or you're alone in a place that was full of people and suddenly it isn't. But I think it's the buildings, which are raw buildings that hold a lot of energy, a lot of passion, a lot of failure, a lot of success. So they're intense buildings, and they're often not done up. So, you know, whatever happened, and it sticks in the walls. Certainly the past shrinks when you're in the theatre. If you're playing something from another time, the language, the rhythm of the language, all of this somehow calls in the energy of whatever it is that was.
The standard sort of view is that if you have a scene which keeps reenacting itself...
Physicist Professor Bernard Carr.
Maybe, in some sense, that scene has been physically recorded in the environment. That's the old-fashioned view of ghosts. I don't personally think it holds much conviction, because there actually isn't any idea of physically what is doing this. The other idea is that, well, maybe these past events still exist in some sense, even if it's not in a normal three-dimensional physical world. And so maybe they really can actually be experienced at the present time. To me, this idea isn't so crazy, because one thing that special relativity taught us, and after all that goes back now 110 years, it tells us that actually not only are space and time combined in a four-dimensional space-time, but it says that past, present and future all coexist. It's what they call the block universe. So once you accept that, in some sense you've got the possibility in principle, if the past still exists, maybe it can impinge on the present. After all, we have memories all the time, and when we have memories, the past is interacting with the present, but it's doing it through our brain. And this is just saying maybe ghosts are just evidence that there's some other way in which the memory can be experienced in the present in some way.
That's the corridor I was talking about.
The one you don't like going down?
The one we don't really like going down, but if you want to go down it, we can. And quite foolishly, the lights are off, but... So again, this would have been, it's now 8 dressing rooms, 4 down here and 4 upstairs, but this would have been housing. It would have been sort of houses again down here. It's always this corridor that sort of spooks people out a little bit, and it's very difficult to sort of say why. There's rumours of a ghost nun that sort of roams this part of the building, because this would have been an alleyway or a road, that at some point in time something awful happened to a nun maybe on this part of a road when she was out and about, because they would have been dark, horrible little sort of alleyways really. And then we also lay claim to, like so many other theatres, Sarah Bernhardt. Sarah Bernhardt lost her leg when she leapt off a piece of scenery and she landed badly, and it resulted in her having a leg amputated. And we lay claim to the fact that happened here in this theatre, so it could also possibly be Sarah Bernhardt that's roaming the corridor, but I can't substantiate that.
With the wooden leg?
With the wooden leg, yeah. So hobbling along, basically. If we head back, we'll go back up to stage door. Just at the very end, mind your step.
Ladies and gentlemen, the performance is about to commence. Please take your seats.
You get that feeling of the tap on the shoulder, the shadow of the past crossing a room. The corridors of the National are full of ghosts, really.
I mean, you are in the dark in the theatre, sitting in wings, you know. It is all about you make up a dream and you live the dream.
Actors linger on. You've got Olivier, Richardson, Gielgud. They don't go away. They don't disappear. Sit there long enough and they'll come and talk to you.
We have to work so hard at the make-believe that we get very near it.
I'm Jack Shepherd, and I'm talking to some of my fellow actors and directors about their ghost stories in Theatreland.
Do you want to hear my story?
Director Richard Eyre.
I was working at the Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh. It may not be coincidental that the play was Macbeth, but I was doing a production and it was Sunday night, extremely tired. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning and we were lighting a scene with the witches. And I looked up to the circle and there was somebody in white who was walking at the back of the circle. And I called out, "Hi, who are you? Because the theatre isn't open at the moment." I don't know why I said that. It was the middle of the night. Anyway, this figure, it became clear she was a woman, and the clothes were late 19th century, rather like a sergeant portrait. And she looked down to the stage and then nodded and continued the walk across the back of the circle. Now, my explanation would be I was prone to visions because my eyes were exhausted and my mind was exhausted, my body was exhausted. My mother had recently had an accident and been on the edge of death, and it's possible that I was summoning up her presence, but that's rather contradicted by the fact this figure looked nothing like my mother and was clearly a figure from the late 19th century.
Surveys show that around 50% of people believe in the paranormal.
Dr. Caroline Watt.
And about half of these think they've had some kind of paranormal experience. And for about 30 years I've been looking into this. I think there's a lot of psychology involved in these paranormal experiences. There's a lot of evidence that if people are sleep deprived, then they are more likely to hallucinate and to have unusual experiences. And a great many paranormal experiences occur particularly during what we call hypnagogic or hypnopompic states, which is as you're drifting off to sleep or as you're coming out of sleep, when the boundary between fantasy and your external life becomes a little bit blurred and it becomes difficult to judge what's internally generated imagery and what's out there. So that's perhaps the most plausible explanation in many cases, but I don't think we can say for certain that that explains everything.
And it certainly doesn't explain one of the occurrences that Thursday at the Palace Theatre at Southend. Now, that Thursday matinee, I was on stage with Terry. I was playing the signalman, he was playing the stranger, and we were sitting in the signal box having a cup of tea. And on the cupboard to my left was a spoon, a knife, a teacup, teapot, when something flew across my vision in front of me, accompanied by this twanging noise. And it was the knife from the top of the cupboard. It had flown 4 feet through the air and landed at Terry's feet. I thought to myself, that's not possible. It couldn't have been. And I looked at Terry for reassurance. But when I caught his eye, he was staring in absolute horror, all the blood drained from his face, even more terrified than I was. I think it was that afternoon that Terry spoke to the ghost underneath the stage, telling him to stop it.
You've not surprised me at all with any of that.
Psychic investigator Archie Laurie.
I mean, I've seen spanners 2 foot long pass through a brick wall and spin around at my feet. So flinging a knife now and again, yeah, it's commonplace. But I personally have been out to just under 700 cases. People have invited me into their homes, their offices, their factories, and I have experienced myself, along with mediums that I've taken with me, the most amazing things.
We head across. We'll follow the man in grey's
Is this the route that he takes along this?
Along the back here,
right.
Yeah. And then he supposedly disappears through the wall there.
Back at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, archivist Mark Fox told me about the ghost of Charles Macklin, who, in 1735, killed a fellow actor following a fight over a wig, and is now said to haunt the upper circle as the man in grey.
Now, I'm pretty sceptical about it all, because that story really grew up from the very famous publicist of the building, the Queen Pope, who in the 1940s wrote a whole series of books, lots of books about the history of theatre, and one of those was about the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, and he wrote at length about the man in grey. But of course, as a publicist and as a man who made a lot of money out of writing his books, he actually knew what the general public wanted to read about. So, so he needed to create as many stories as he could. But having said that, at a photo call for the dancing years, about 30 members of the cast reckoned that they saw the man in grey walk across the back of the auditorium. And the other famous story for the man in grey was a cleaner who actually saw him sat in a seat and went down to ask him to move. When she got there, he was no longer there, so she went to see the manager to say she thought there was an intruder. And when she described the chap, she described him as being in a three-cornered hat and a cloak. We're just coming into the auditorium now, so you can see the bank of seats that heads down towards the stage. You can see it's actually quite dark up here now. This is the sort of level of light that it would be at the daytime all the time. In fact, there's probably more light here than there would have been in the 40s. So all those people saying that they could see him up here, it's a long way away.
But when you get 30 people seeing a phenomenon like that, it's different, isn't it, to when just one person who might be spooked late at night sees or feels something in the building. I mean, one of the explanations for these kind of apparitions is that it's a sort of time slip. There's that famous ghost story of the plumber in York about 50 years ago, who was up a ladder in a deep sewer and saw an entire Roman legion walk past. What's interesting about that story is that they were at the Roman level as they marched. Therefore, he only saw them from the knees upwards. He didn't see the shins and the feet and the sandals, anything like that. So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at these phenomena, that time isn't the consistent, regular, linear thing that our lives are.
Yeah.
It's something else that we don't fully understand. And sometimes you get a blip in the system.
One of the key features of many of these sorts of phenomena, not just apparitions, but more general psychic phenomena, is that there is a sense in which they seem to transcend space and time.
Physicist Professor Bernard Carr.
It's as though time has slipped and that you've gone into the past, or maybe even into the future. And so the question is, well, is there a level of physics which could accommodate time slip experiences? In a sense, when we talk about our final theory of quantum gravity, we're trying to have a description that goes beyond space and time. So it doesn't seem to me inconceivable that there could be a description of the world which transcends the normal space-time description. In other words, which says that the past and the present and the future can, in some sense, coexist. But the point is, it has to go beyond the classical view of physics, because it's clear the classical view of physics can't explain these phenomena. Classical physics can't even explain the normal passage of time. So we know we've got to go beyond that anyway.
Spirit beings can be curious like everybody else. Like the one in the Pitlochry Theatre. the man who died in the 1500s. And when we met him in, 2008 or something like that, and we asked him why he was backstage looking at things, he just says, "I'm puzzled about what you're doing."
I still have an open mind. I suppose I favour the scientific explanation over the spiritual. A belief in the spirit world finally comes down to a question of faith, which I don't have. But I don't deny the possibility that such a world exists. A person who denies the possibility of the irrational is the person most likely to become possessed by it, should they be confronted by something they can't explain. But there's no certainty in the scientific explanation either. The more we understand about a thing, the more complex it becomes, and the more there is still to find out. Scientific advancement is like a series of doors, each leading to the next mystery, and there's no end in sight, or ever will be, I suspect. For a final word, here's an old colleague of mine, Gordon Granger.
I had an aunt, my Aunt Meta in Ireland, who I went to stay with, and she got me to do a bit of Shakespeare, and I learnt and did the final speech of Romeo. Jump 20, 30 years, and I'm in the dressing room at the Bristol Old Vic, and I'm going through the same sort of lines. How oft, when men are at the point of death, have they been merry? And suddenly, well, not suddenly, I heard this laughter. She had an extraordinary laugh, a very catching laugh. And she used to call me Gone, which is how you pronounce it in Ireland. And I heard the laughter, and then I heard Gone, Gone. Then it was over. Next, I'm on stage, and I'm performing, and I get to the final speech, and I look up, and in the box on the right-hand side, there was a woman in grey. I go back to the dressing room, find my makeup thrown about on the floor, as though somebody had tried to write something on a mirror. And then I talked to the stage management and said, "Oh yes, well, you've seen the woman in grey, who apparently turns up. If you see her on a dress rehearsal," which is what this was, "your show's going to be successful."